Hook. Imagine waking up one morning to a silence so deep it feels heavier than sound. No wind. No birds. No distant wagon wheels. Just cold, an endless, breath-stealing cold that seems to press against your chest like an unseen weight. You pull your blanket closer, but the cold is already inside the walls, inside the floorboards, inside your breath. Outside, the world has turned white and still, as if time itself has frozen in place. This was not a single storm. This was not a bad week. This was not just winter. This was the winter that would not end. In the year 1880, America entered a season so long, so unforgiving, that people would speak of it in hushed voices for generations. A winter that erased roads, silenced towns, and turned ordinary survival into a daily uncertainty. There were no weather forecasts. No central heating. No instant help arriving from far away. Only snow, ice, and patience, tested beyond its limits. Tonight, we return to that frozen year. Not to rush. Not to escape. But to slowly walk through the cold, step by quiet step. This is the story of America's longest winter. And how it refused to let go. When the cold arrived early. The winter of 1880 did not announce itself with drama. It did not arrive with a single violent storm or a sudden catastrophe that demanded attention. Instead, it came quietly, almost politely, slipping into the edges of daily life before anyone realized it had no intention of leaving. Autumn had barely settled across the American landscape when the cold began to linger longer than expected. In the northern plains, farmers noticed frost forming earlier than usual, thin white lines creeping across fields that should still have been soft and brown. In small towns scattered across the Midwest, mornings felt sharper, the air biting just enough to make people pause before stepping outside. At first, no one worried. Winters were cold. They always had been. People trusted the rhythm of the seasons because it had never truly betrayed them before. A cold snap here. A snowfall there. Then a brief thaw, just enough to remind everyone that spring would eventually return. But this time, the thaw never came. By late November, snow began falling steadily across large portions of the country. Not the dramatic, swirling kind that inspires excitement, but a persistent, quiet snowfall that never seemed to stop. Day after day, night after night, flakes drifted down, layering the land in silence. Roads disappeared first. Dirt paths that connected farms and towns slowly vanished beneath white blankets, their familiar curves erased until everything looked the same. Fence posts became short, dark stubs poking out of the snow. Trees stood frozen in place, their branches heavy, unmoving. In cities like Chicago and Minneapolis, people still tried to maintain normal life. Streetcars ran when they could. Shops opened late and closed early. Children pressed their faces to frosted windows, watching the world soften into white shapes. But in rural America, isolation arrived quickly. Farms that relied on weekly trips to town found themselves cut off. Horses struggled through drifts that grew deeper with every passing day. Wagons moved slower, then not at all. What had once been a short journey became an exhausting, dangerous effort. Inside wooden homes, the cold began to seep through everything. Fireplaces burned constantly, yet rooms never fully warmed. Floors felt like ice beneath bare feet. Water froze in buckets overnight. Even breath seemed heavier, as if the air itself had thickened. People slept in layers of clothing, coats folded beside them, boots left near the bed in case the fire went out during the night. Many families gathered into a single room, sharing warmth not just for comfort, but for survival. And still, the snow kept falling. By December, it was clear this winter was different. Railroads, symbols of American progress and connection, began to fail. Tracks disappeared beneath snowdrifts taller than a man. Trains stalled in the open countryside, surrounded by endless white, unable to move forward or backward. Passengers waited inside cold cars, wrapped in blankets, listening to the wind scrape against metal walls. Telegraph lines sagged and snapped under the weight of ice, cutting off communication between towns. News traveled slowly now, carried by word of mouth, if it traveled at all. Entire communities existed in silence, unaware of how widespread the cold had become. Food supplies grew uncertain. Pantries that once seemed well-stocked suddenly felt small. Flour, dried beans, salted meat, items meant to last the winter, were rationed carefully. Every meal became a quiet calculation. Not just of hunger, but of time. How long would this last? How much longer would the cold remain? Outside, animals struggled alongside humans. Cattle huddled together for warmth, their breath rising in thick clouds. Chickens stopped laying eggs. Horses grew thin as feed became harder to reach beneath frozen ground and deep snow. Yet through all of this, there was still hope. People told themselves this was temporary. That January would bring change. That the calendar itself promised relief. They marked days carefully, crossing off dates with numb fingers, believing that winter, like all winters before it, would eventually loosen its grip. But January arrived carrying even colder air. Temperatures dropped further, sinking lower than anyone could remember. In some regions, thermometers fell so far that they seemed almost unreal, numbers that belonged more to distant Arctic lands than to American towns and farms. The cold no longer just surrounded people, it shaped every decision. Going outside became an act of preparation. Scarves wrapped tightly. Faces covered. Skin exposed for only seconds at a time. Frostbite was no longer a rare accident but a constant threat. Fingers numbed quickly. Ears burned, then went strangely quiet. The landscape itself felt changed. Snowdrifts hardened into walls of ice. Wind carved strange patterns across open fields, sculpting the surface into ridges and waves. At night, the world glowed faintly under moonlight, endless and empty, a frozen ocean stretching in every direction. And still, there was no sign of an ending. As weeks passed, something subtle began to change inside people. Not panic. Not fear. But a deep, quiet fatigue. The kind that settles slowly, unnoticed at first, until it becomes part of everything. Conversations grew shorter. Laughter came less easily. People conserved energy, words, and hope. Even children played more quietly, their movements slower, their games shorter. This was not the winter of dramatic disasters and sudden collapses. This was the winter of waiting. Waiting for warmth. Waiting for movement. Waiting for the simple sound of melting snow. But the winter of 1880 was not finished. It had only just begun. Life slows, isolation deepens. By February, the winter of 1880 had established itself as more than a season. It had become a presence. People no longer spoke of cold casually, they spoke of the winter itself, as though it were a living, watchful force, indifferent to human plans or comforts. Villages and towns that had once felt connected by railroads, post offices, and familiar roads now seemed suspended in time, each isolated in its own frozen pocket of the country. The snow drifts grew taller, creeping over fences, swallowing outhouses, and burying familiar landmarks. A simple walk to the neighbor's house could take an hour or more, each step exhausting, every breath visible in the frigid air. Inside homes, the rhythm of life slowed. Families moved deliberately, conserving energy as if every motion spent against the cold was precious. Fires burned constantly, yet rooms remained heavy with chill. Kitchens became sanctuaries not just for warmth but for survival, where meals were prepared carefully to stretch scarce resources. Even the act of lighting a lamp or tending a candle required planning, as fuel was rationed. Outside, the world was transformed. The landscape had taken on a surreal quality, long stretches of white, broken only by the dark shapes of buildings or the occasional figure moving silently across a field. Trees, encased in ice, looked like frozen sculptures. Rivers, once flowing and familiar, were silent, hard ribbons of ice that gleamed faintly under the weak winter sun. Animals, human companions in the struggle to survive, adjusted or suffered. Cattle huddled in tight groups, seeking warmth through proximity. Horses, essential for transportation and labor, required constant care, feeding, and protection from the relentless cold. Chickens no longer laid eggs, and the small flock that had provided daily nourishment now only reminded families of scarcity. Communication became an ordeal. Telegraph lines, already fragile, frequently failed under the weight of ice, leaving towns disconnected for days or even weeks. Mail was slow, sometimes impossible. In many rural areas, news of the outside world became a vague, distant concept. People relied on the few travelers who could navigate the snow-laden roads to bring stories and updates, and even those journeys were dangerous. A trip that normally took a few hours could turn into a life-threatening expedition. The psychological effect of the winter was subtle but profound. People adjusted their expectations, accepted discomfort, and even began to find strange comfort in the quiet monotony. Yet isolation had its cost. Loneliness crept in, unannounced, alongside the frost. Children grew quieter, less energetic, their games shrinking into small corners of rooms. Adults spoke less, conserving warmth and energy. People began to measure time not by dates or hours, but by changes in the snow, the subtle shifts in temperature, or the arrival of a scarce delivery. Winter had revealed the fragility of human plans. It stripped life to essentials: warmth, food, shelter, and connection. Comforts previously taken for granted, fuel, heat, companionship, now defined survival. And in this quiet, endless struggle, people learned patience on a scale few could have imagined. This was not a winter of sudden disasters or dramatic tragedies. It was a winter of endurance, of waiting, of small victories quietly celebrated behind frozen windows. And as February progressed, there was a creeping realization among many: this winter might not end on anyone's schedule. It was teaching lessons in resilience, persistence, and the astonishing capacity of people to adapt when the world itself seemed frozen against them. The long nights, the frozen roads, the silent fields, and the dim, filtered light all combined to create a new rhythm of life, a rhythm dictated by cold, stillness, and survival. And yet, amidst the hardship, the quiet moments of wonder persisted: the delicate lace of frost on a windowpane, the sun glinting off an icicle, the serene beauty of snow settling over a barn at dawn. Life slowed, but it also revealed its hidden, delicate grace. By the end of February, families, travelers, and townspeople alike understood something fundamental: the winter of 1880 would test every expectation of normalcy. It would stretch human endurance, patience, and imagination. And it would leave memories so vivid that even decades later, those who had survived would recall the soundless nights, the glimmering days, and the relentless persistence of a season that refused to release its grip. The final grip of winter. March arrived, yet it brought no relief. The snow persisted, refusing to melt, as if the land itself had entered a frozen trance. Farmers looked out over fields that remained hidden beneath unbroken white, their plows useless, their crops trapped beneath layers of ice. Roads remained impassable, towns isolated, and the rhythm of daily life still dictated entirely by the relentless cold. The long winter had settled like an uninvited guest that would not leave. Food scarcity became a pressing concern. Pantries that had seemed well-stocked in November were now depleted. Families rationed what little remained, measuring each meal carefully, sometimes eating less than they needed to conserve supplies for the uncertain days ahead. Hunting and gathering became increasingly difficult. Deep snow buried game and froze streams where fish had once been plentiful. Those who had relied on local markets found them closed or unreachable, trapped behind drifts taller than wagons. Railroads and transportation systems were crippled completely. Trains stalled for days in snowdrifts, passengers bundled in blankets, waiting in silence, listening to the wind scrape relentlessly against metal walls. Supplies that might have rescued starving towns were trapped along the frozen tracks, and communities had to rely on what they had, improvising to survive. Telegraph lines snapped under the weight of ice, cutting off communication and leaving towns feeling as though the outside world no longer existed. Yet in the midst of this hardship, stories of human ingenuity and quiet heroism emerged. Families devised clever ways to melt ice for water, ration fuel efficiently, and protect animals from the bitter cold. Communities shared what little they had, organizing relief where they could, even as exhaustion weighed heavily on all. Survival required calm, patience, and creativity, and people rose to the challenge in ways that might have seemed unimaginable. In normal circumstances, children learned to navigate the silent, snow-covered world with care. They moved slowly, conserving warmth, understanding instinctively the fragility of life in the frozen landscape. They found small joys in the beauty around them, icicles glinting in the weak sun, patterns of frost on windows, the rare appearance of a blue sky behind thick clouds. Even amidst scarcity and isolation, the hypnotic beauty of the winter held them in quiet awe. By mid-March, the ice had begun to show the faintest signs of release. Small streams trickled again, and distant patches of soil peeked through snowbanks, yet the thaw was cautious, uneven, almost reluctant. Nature itself seemed to respect the extraordinary persistence of this season, unwilling to restore normalcy too quickly. People, too, remained cautious, their bodies and minds having grown accustomed to extreme vigilance. The winter of 1880 left lasting impressions. It was not remembered for dramatic disasters alone, but for the subtle, pervasive challenge it posed to daily life. It tested patience, endurance, and adaptability on a scale few had ever experienced. It forced communities to slow down, to observe, to appreciate the fragility and resilience of human life in ways that would echo for decades. Families passed down stories of frozen mornings, dark nights, and the quiet victories of survival, teaching subsequent generations about perseverance, resourcefulness, and respect for the power of nature. By late March, life slowly began to regain rhythm. Roads became passable, trains moved again, and communication lines were restored. Yet the memory of a winter that would not end lingered. People recalled the endless snow, the frozen landscapes, the silent nights, and the delicate beauty hidden within the hardship. They remembered how the long cold had reshaped not just the land but the way they thought, moved, and connected with each other. And so, America emerged from its longest, coldest winter, not unscathed, but changed. The winter of 1880 was more than a season, it was a testament to human resilience, to the quiet determination required to endure extreme circumstances, and to the subtle lessons that only time, patience, and survival can teach. Even as the snow finally melted, and the thaw restored warmth and movement, the winter that refused to end remained alive in stories, memories, and the quiet respect of those who had lived through it. The long winter of 1880 had ended, but its imprint on the land and on human hearts endured, a reminder that nature's patience can often outlast our own, and that survival is as much about stillness and endurance as it is about action. And for those who hear this story today, in the quiet of their own homes, perhaps wrapped in blankets as snow drifts silently against their windows, the winter of 1880 whispers its final lesson: even in the coldest, longest nights, humanity endures, quietly, patiently, and with an unbroken resolve.